The morning after a brief, nervous silence on a country road in northern France, August 1944, a German maintenance detail drifted toward an abandoned American cargo truck whose engine metal still held the night's warmth, the kind of workhorse the Allies called a Deuce-and-a-Half, and the U.S. Army catalogued as the GMC CCKW 2 ton 6x6 Jimmy. The Luftwaffe's presence over France was thinning to scattered, risky sorties after the Normandy breakout, and even their rare strafing runs could not halt the great push east once Allied air power clamped down on roads, bridges, and rail lines feeding the front. The truck, a long-wheelbase CCKW 353 by silhouette and stance, looked ordinary, canvas cover, ladder frame, beam axles on leaf springs, but the ordinariness itself was the quiet threat. This was a standard solution built by the tens of thousands to the same pattern. One Feldwebel tugged the hood latch, another steadied a flashlight on the inline six. The first impression was not elegance but clarity. GMC's commercial-derived 270 engine, a 269. 5 cu in overhead valve straight six rated around 91.5 to 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute, sat open and readable, the kind of powerplant designed to be understood quickly and serviced in the field. The crew had pulled apart their own Opel trucks for years, good machines, precise and road-strong, yet nothing on those felt so deliberately arranged for hands that might touch it only once after a week of mud, frost, and fatigue. A private found the toolkit clipped by the step and, tucked beside it, a maintenance manual, not a dense book of workshop code, but a U.S. technical manual with step-by-step instructions, periodic service charts, and exploded diagrams, pictures for soldiers who could follow pictures while tired in the rain. The Feldwebel turned a few pages and saw why these vehicles seemed to keep moving, consumables scheduled on simple intervals, lubrication orders mapped by diagram, and procedures broken into tasks any unit mechanic could execute without special jigs or factory fixtures. When he dropped to his back to inspect the transfer case and prop shafts, he could see that the driveline and 6x6 layout were built around a two-range transfer case that engaged the front axle. No mystery there, just a direct way to put torque to all wheels when the road turned to churn clay or shell-shattered verges. The suspension told the same story, beam axles on leaf springs front and tandem rear, crude in theory and resilient in practice, forgiving to knocks, sag, and bush repairs, robustness chosen over refinement for the sake of uptime. Someone muttered that a skilled artisan's hands had not designed this so much as a system had, an army system, a factory system, a nation system, then closed the manual and realized the point was not how clever one component was, but how fast the entire vehicle could be understood, driven, maintained, and sent back down the road. He had heard the Americans call these trucks the backbone of their logistics, that they had put thousands into convoy service after Normandy, and that something named the Red Ball Express would soon turn French roads into one-way arteries of fuel and ammunition. The schedule for that convoy system, beginning August 25, 1944, had been hammered together in just 36 hours, and at its height nearly 6,000 vehicles would run up to 12,500 tons of supplies a day to the advancing armies. The Feldwebel had no way to know the numbers, but he could feel their outline in the plainness of the truck under his hands. The hood stamped steel was thick enough to take abuse, the bed built for cargo not ceremony, and the ladder frame straight and strong, the sort of thing that could be aligned with a tape measure and a pry bar if it took a hit and still carry on. A corporal eased the transfer case lever through its gate and grinned at the simplicity of the motion. Their own 4x2 lorries could be coaxed through mud, yes, but this design created traction rather than begged for it, a difference that meant missed bogging and saved days. He ran a hand over the tire sidewalls, standard 7. 5020, another everyday choice that made scaling up easier when depots were stacked with the same sizes and mechanics did not waste time chasing oddities. When the Feldwebel asked for the manual again, he found a section that read like an operator's catechism: daily checks and services, tire inspections, leak patrols, at-halt routines, each page consecrated to the idea that preventive maintenance, not miracles, kept vehicles alive. The text showed how Army technical manuals and lubrication orders organized tasks so that organizational echelons, soldiers and unit mechanics, handled the ordinary work, while deeper faults migrated to medium and heavy maintenance echelons who could swap engines, transmissions, or assemblies in a day. It was the gospel of modular repair the Americans had refined: fix what you can where you are, swap what's slow, and never leave a truck dead longer than the time it takes to unbolt and bolt again. The German crew could not miss the contrast with their own logistics culture, where common sense and craftsmanship often met shortages of parts and where too many vehicle types meant too many unique components fighting for the same space on the same shelves. What this CCKW radiated was standardization, dimensions and diagrams, procedures and parts catalogued in a common tongue, so that any soldier who could read a picture could keep the vehicle in the fight. Far away, pilots were sweeping the skies of what was left of the enemy's challenge over France, an air war that after June had tilted decisively in favor of the Allies, air superiority that screened ground columns, interdicted roads and rails, and punished any daylight massing that tried to move against the breakout. That dominance also meant the Americans could risk convoys by day, knowing that their trucks were more visible but also more protected than any horse line that had to hide at dusk and forage at dawn. The Feldwebel thought of his division tables, how many horses, how much fodder, how often the teams had to rest, and then looked at the CCKW's tank, 40 gallons for a 300-mile range on paper, a mathematics of gasoline that traded haystacks and veterinary care for fuel cans and a wrench. He would not yet call it a better way, but he knew it was a way that scaled, consign a million small tasks to millions of ordinary hands, write the tasks in pictures and checklists, and feed them all with parts that fit across fleets rather than a single mark. If the Opel Blitz had been the face of Germany's motor transport, a capable 3-ton truck that gave reliable service across theaters, then the CCKW was the face of an American production doctrine that turned capability into an industrial rhythm. The Opel story was one of factory pride and wartime strain. This truck story was one of sheer multiplication, of design trimmed to what could be built fast, fixed fast, and used hard by drivers who might have learned clutch and brake only weeks ago. A mechanic pointed at the stamped data plate and translated the essentials, model, payload, lubrication references, as if the truck were constantly reintroducing itself to whoever touched it next. Another folded the manual to a page of winter service, a note on sub-zero maintenance for air cleaners and oil, proof that the text anticipated cold, mud, and neglect rather than pretending away the realities of war. It is built to be mistreated and keep going, someone said, not as an accusation but with the puzzled respect of a man who has spent years trying to coax precision machinery to behave in conditions that tolerated no delicacy. He could imagine the convoy tapes that would soon appear along French verges, red circles marking roads where trucks had the right of way and everything else was supposed to get out of it, the Red Ball Express beginning on August 25, a straight-line answer to a theater-wide shortage of time. The truck before them looked like a piece of that answer, a 2.5-ton plank in a bridge thrown across a continent, not the most beautiful timber, but the timber you had by the acre, the kind that could bend and not break under load. It was in that ordinariness, beam axles, leaf springs, a 2-range transfer case, a commercial-derived inline-six, that the Germans felt something like inevitability, the sense that a system larger than the truck had already decided the terms of the next months. The Feldwebel closed the hood, handed the manual back, and said what none of them wanted to hear, that their army's logistics ran, in great part, on hay and hope, while the enemy's ran on gasoline and instructions. He did not need to be a philosopher to see it, he only needed to count, pages filled with diagrams, road signs with red circles, and trucks measured in the tens of thousands instead of the dozens. The war had become a contest of maintenance as much as maneuver, of manuals as much as maps, and this unremarkable Jimmy made that reality impossible to ignore. They began with the small things, the way the controls fell to hand, the way the labels told a tired driver exactly what each lever did, and realized this truck was less a feat of finesse than a choreography of actions designed to minimize error under stress. The transfer case lever sat ready to drop the truck into high or low and even into neutral to uncouple the axles, while a separate front axle lever clicked from out to in with a logic that forced engagement before you could ever select low range, a mechanical safeguard written into the gate itself. A mechanic ran that sequence slowly, front axle in, then transfer case to low, feeling how procedure was embedded in steel so that muscle memory could not betray the manual. The CCKW's 6x6 layout wasn't a boast but a promise, torque would go where traction lived, and on French farm tracks churned to porridge by rain, that meant forward motion when a 4x2 stopped to think. The leaf-sprung beam axles front and tandem rear looked unglamorous next to the smoother ride of peacetime roads, but each shackle and pack whispered resilience, the kind that forgives abuse and gets straightened with a hammer if the day insists. Where a peacetime engineer might design for comfort, this machine was designed for certainty, and certainty in war starts with a truck that will pull and keep pulling even when the road dissolves. Under the hood, the commercial-derived inline-six breathed like many such engines in America's fleets, the sort that could be taught to a new driver in an afternoon and maintained by a corporal with a grease gun and a checklist. The technical manual did not assume a master mechanic, it assumed a soldier who could read a diagram and follow a sequence, lubrication orders by interval, daily checks by habit, spark and fuel service by picture. Toolkits were specified and tasks were bounded, not to diminish skill, but to make skill reliably repeatable across thousands of hands, so that a company's maintenance hour looked like a company's drill. What the Germans called craftsmanship, the Americans turned into procedure, with the manual's dry voice insisting that prevention was cheaper than repair and that repair was faster when assemblies were meant to be swapped. That philosophy didn't scorn complexity, it organized it, pushing deep work to echelons where the tools, spares, and time existed, and leaving the line soldiers with what they could finish before the next convoy rolled. First and second echelons, operators and unit mechanics, owned the daily pulse. Third and fourth echelons, medium and heavy maintenance, shouldered the replacements and rebuilds that kept the fleet's heartbeat steady in the long campaign. The transfer case itself seemed almost conversational, its functions spelled out in the book with an economy of words and a surplus of clarity: lever here for range, lever there for axle, never low without the front axle because bogging a heavy truck in low with only two wheels pulling is the kind of mistake you prevent before it happens. A fitter traced the linkages from cab to case and nodded at the way motion transmitted into engagement, everything serviceable without lifting a cab or disassembling half the chassis. He had fought stubborn gearboxes before, their secrets locked behind housings that wanted special pullers and a prayer. Here, inspection covers and gasket plates promised a straightforward path to the parts that failed most. The CCKW asked for loyalty in small, regular payments, grease today, an adjustment tomorrow, rather than catastrophic debts paid in a week of downtime when a mission could least afford it. In that sense, the maintenance book was not an appendix to the truck, it was part of its drivetrain, a silent gear that turned procedures into motion. On the road, the differences turned from theory into ground truth. Where a typical German 3-tonner with a 4x2 layout had to read the road for ruts and choose lines like a cautious chess player, the 6x6 could take imperfect ground at convoy pace, trading elegance for momentum. The Opel Blitz was a fine truck and the standard of the Wehrmacht, but the armies had asked it to do things that a 4x2 does only with care, while the rarer 4x4 Allrad variants existed in numbers too small to redefine the experience of a column in rain. Most Blitz production in the war years skewed to 4x2s models, reliable on roads, vulnerable in mire, and always in contention with the season and the soil for the right to pass. A German driver knew when to back off to keep a truck alive, an American driver with a CCKW learned when to press because the drivetrain could make its own luck. Back in the yard, a corporal laid the standard U.S. checks out loud like a litany: fuel, oil, water, tires, tools, then put the truck up on blocks and walked through wheel bearing play, brake linkage tension, and driveline inspection exactly as the chapter prescribed. The book's logic was clockwork: find trouble early, fix it at the lowest level, and escalate only when time, tools, or specialization demanded a higher echelon. Medium maintenance could lift a transmission and hang another before dusk. Heavy maintenance could take an engine back to specification while the unit rolled on a replacement, a swap culture that measured readiness not in perfection but in availability. There was no romance in this, only a kind of austere mercy for the men at the front who needed food, fuel, and shells more than they needed a mechanic's pride. Every grease fitting served a schedule, every linkage had a tolerance, and every hour saved in the motor pool showed up as an extra mile under load. To the Germans, what first looked like simplicity revealed itself as system integration, the way design, documentation, training, and supply talked to each other without arguing over dialect. The manual cited parts by common numbers that matched depot ledgers, so a requisition written at a roadside map table matched the crate that showed up 2 days later. The transfer case levers and detents didn't just prevent misuse, they made standard behaviors almost automatic, the human factor lowered not by scolding but by design. Even the feel of the truck began to make sense, the way the clutch took up, the way the axles bit when engaged, predictability that eased the load on a driver already tired by blackout roads and sudden orders. The experience of operation was teaching the same lesson the maintenance doctrine taught: build machines that forgive, write instructions that assume fatigue, and organize repair so that what breaks today does not defeat tomorrow. When the mechanics took the captured CCKW on their own supply run, the road south of town had become a paste of clay, chaff, and pulverized stone, and the places where 4x2 trucks eased to a stop to plan a safer approach were the very places the 6x6 walked through with the engine humming in second low. The corporal did not swagger. He watched the temperature and listened to the driveline and treated the truck like a partner built to carry sin without complaint. Back in the park, they raised the hood again and the Feldwebel tapped the manual where the spark and fuel sections lived, noting how every routine was bundled to keep small faults from compounding into big ones. He imagined his own unit's maintenance logbooks, the entries written in cramped hands about parts that never came in trucks that waited for someone who knew a particular make's peculiarities, and felt the difference between a fleet and a collection. The Opel Blitz remained a respectable instrument, but the CCKW was part of an orchestra, and the score was written so that any competent player could take a seat and keep time. The more they handled the truck, the more they saw how little time was wasted on ambiguities, how even the banality of a declutching lever labeled in and out represented a judgment against friction in all its forms, mechanical, procedural, and human. If war is partly the art of turning hours into miles, then the CCKW's genius was to shave the rough edges off those hours with levers that could only be moved in the right order and instructions that could be followed by men who had not slept enough. Where their own training often favored oral tradition and local expertise, the American method wrote down what worked and issued it to everyone, so that a truck in Brittany and a truck in the Vosges would be spoken to in the same grammar. What began as a teardown had become a translation, a reading of America's logistics language in stamped steel, cast housings, and greased fittings, and it read the same from cab to case to depot. The verdict, for now, was not that the CCKW was perfect, but that it was relentlessly practical, and in the mud of France, practicality was a weapon. They found the numbers stamped where grease and grit couldn't hide them, codes and marks that traced the truck's birth back to Pontiac, Michigan, yellow truck and coach before the renaming to GMC, and to the vast production rhythm that would soon pull St. Louis into cadence as a second assembly stream for the same machine. It was a shock that felt strangely bureaucratic, a truck that could tell you not only what it was, but which river of American industry had carried it into the war, a river already splitting into multiple channels so the flow would never slow. The Feldwebel had worked in an Opel plant before the war and knew how a single factory's heartbeat could quicken or falter depending on dies, deliveries, and daylight, but here he glimpsed something else entirely, parallel lines, parallel plants, and a design meant to travel cleanly across them without losing its shape. Word had reached them that the Jimmy existed by the hundreds of thousands, and now the plate and stamps made that rumor plausible. The record would show that CCKW production alone would crest above 500,000 units, with long wheelbase 353s making up the lion's share, and the broader 2.5-ton family pushing total outputs into the range of roughly 572,500 when including kin like the CCW 6x4 and the amphibious DUKW. The Opel Blitz, a proud 3-tonner and backbone of German motor transport, would never be built in numbers that could answer those figures, its totals typically cited on the order of 100,000 across the war, most in 4x2 form, good trucks, but not enough trucks, and not with the same traction. The men didn't need a lecture in economics to understand what the stamps implied, they needed only to look at a convoy road and count how many identical silhouettes ran past in an hour without stuttering. The supply officer crouched by the ladder frame and tapped the straight channels, simple rails that any competent press and weld line could repeat, and said the word that mattered more than performance that day, producibility. Body panels here didn't beg for sculpture, they preferred form that a heavy press could stamp all afternoon without tears, the sort of process cities like Pontiac had spent decades mastering, with presses capable of exerting thousands of tons to push steel into shapes within predictable tolerances. Even the cargo body told a story of materials management under constraint. Steel when available, would when steel's ration bit hard, because a bed built of standard timber could be cut, planed, and bolted by shops that didn't need to be part of a single corporate lineage to meet a war schedule. Canvas covers, tarred and riveted and laced, spoke a commercial dialect common to tent makers and fabric houses, an ease of sourcing that meant a torn roof was a procurement problem, not an existential one. What the Americans had done, what the truck embodied, was to translate an entire manufacturing philosophy into the bolts and planks of a single vehicle, standardization that allowed multiple plants to speak the same grammar without tripping over each other's verbs. War had forced choices, and in 1942 the War Production Board formalized them, imposing priorities that made certain the right factories produced the right items, while the Controlled Materials Plan parceled steel, copper, and aluminum so lines kept moving instead of hoarding and starving in turn. In that world, designs that tolerated substitution and avoided exotic materials, designs like the CCKW, rose to the top because they turned allocation into output without requiring miracles. The officer looked at the gaskets, the fasteners, the timber slats, and saw not parts but policy made tangible. He remembered the speech that had rung across radios years earlier, the American president's phrase, "Arsenal of Democracy," and how odd it had sounded then, like a slogan looking for a factory, and realized here it had found one, a truck line that made the phrase a daily fact. The rhetoric had not been about heroics, it had been about capacity, about turning entire cities into supply, and this CCKW bristled with the consequences of that choice in the way its pieces fit, its manuals read, and its production lived in more than one place at once. A nation that planned to be an arsenal did not design for single-source brilliance, it designed for multi-source sameness that could be audited, counted, and shipped in trains and ships without a foreman's prayer at every crate. The Opel man traced how easily this truck could be built by different hands. Straight frame rails with generous radii where stress would collect, cross members that didn't require elaborate jigs, and cab stampings that could accept slight variances without scrapping a day's work. He contrasted that with the Blitz's precise rails and narrower tolerances, fine on a calm day in peacetime, touchier when a war pressed for quantity and substitutes, and when the exact steel you wanted arrived late. In Germany, engineering pride often led, and production raced to keep up. In the United States, production dictated terms early, and engineering trimmed its sail to catch that wind. Neither approach was without merit, but one of them filled roads faster. Stamped numbers were now more frightening than muzzle flashes. They whispered that what the Germans saw in this single truck was multiplied across cities and states, from Pontiac to St. Louis, with the same SNL and TM numbers, the same lubrication charts, and the same parts bins ready to feed identical work orders. The officer imagined a crate marked for a depot on the Cotentin and a crate marked for a depot near Reims and pictured them open to reveal the same shafts, the same seals, the same bearings and the same wrappers, because manuals and catalogs forced conformity all the way back to the cutters and presses. That is how a design becomes a system, when paperwork and production live in agreement so complete that no one needs to improvise to do the right thing. He ran a finger along the bed plank and thought about material substitution again. What could be made to carry steel's load for cargo when the mission was volume, not armor, and when the governing constraint was how many trucks could be put on the road this quarter with the steel allotted. The Controlled Materials Plan had been invented precisely to ensure that steel, copper, and aluminum reached where they yielded the greatest strategic output, and the CCKW was designed to thrive under such rationing by never insisting on rare ingredients for basic function. When a vehicle's bill of materials synergizes with a nation's allocation scheme, the end result is rhythm, parts arrive, workshops build, depots stock, brigades receive, columns move. To the mechanics, the philosophy had a feel, fewer bolt sizes to search for, fewer specialized fixtures to beg from higher echelons, and assemblies that could be lifted and replaced without stripping a truck to its bones. That kind of design is not an afterthought, it's a precondition for distributing production across multiple plants and still producing one truck rather than a family of near twins that bled time in the field. In that sense, Pontiac and St. Louis were not only places, they were proofs that the blueprint had been written to be understood in different dialects of tooling and still produce the same sentence on the road. The Opel man, who loved the dignity of a precisely formed frame, did not stop loving it. He simply understood now that dignity does not decide campaigns when the other side can flood a continent with good enough built so predictably that a spare drive shaft can travel from a warehouse to a ditch in France without anyone asking whether it will fit. His calculations shifted from how well to how many, how fast, and on that axis the CCKW's lineage, conceived by Yellow Truck and Coach and multiplied by GM's broader footprint, had already answered the question by existing everywhere at once. The truck wasn't superior because it was more refined, it was superior because it had been designed to be reproduced and repaired at a speed the war demanded. He pictured the Red Ball Express beginning to draw its routes and imagined the procurement officer's ledger turning part numbers into tonnage per day, the dull magic by which a cab pressed in Michigan and a bed assembled in Missouri became a gallon of fuel in a Sherman outside Paris. None of that worked unless the truck was a willing partner to scale, unless its parts came from processes that could be duplicated and sustained under rationing and shock, and the CCKW had been drafted into that kind of war long before its tires touched French mud. The Germans could mock the plainness of its panels, the truck would answer with miles. What finally settled over the team was a kind of practical awe. They were not simply looking at a vehicle, they were looking at a policy made manifest, at the sum of decisions that valued interchangeability over idiosyncrasy, volume over virtuosity, and schedule over sentiment. The officer stood, brushed dust from his knees, and said that their mistake had been to assume that excellence inside a single factory would be enough when the enemy had chosen to make the factory itself into a weapon. The truck did not argue, it only waited to be started and put back to work, which was, after all, the entire point. They first noticed the rhythm, a line of American trucks cresting the rise and pouring east without pause, the kind of motorized artery given a name, Red Ball Express, that would begin its run on August 25th and keep the front alive with a daily pulse of fuel, rations, and shells. The convoy did not look tactical so much as inevitable, an administrative miracle on wheels that had been conceived in 36 hours and, at its height, fielded 5,958 vehicles to move roughly 12,500 tons a day for nearly 3 months. The Germans tried to count as the trucks rolled past and soon stopped because counting suggested an endpoint, and this looked like a route without one, a dedicated priority road marked by red circles where these vehicles had the right of way over everything else. On that road, discipline became geometry. Convoys of at least 5 trucks with jeep escorts, 60-yard intervals, a top speed of 25 miles per hour, blackout, cat-eye, covers at night, and traffic control points that logged weights, destinations, and routes, keeping the stream from choking on its own momentum. The watching mechanics were used to columns that breathed and bunched. This one seemed to exhale at a constant rate, its lungs measured in tonnage rather than minutes. What they could not see from the ditch they felt in the ground, the scale that made the express more than a name, an average of about 900 trucks on the road at any time and over 412,000 tons delivered by the time the route closed in November as ports opened and railways returned to service. Reporters would later call it part of a miracle of supply, but to the soldiers who drove it that miracle was long hours, tight intervals, and a route that refused improvisation in favor of throughput. The express lasted 82 days and delivered an estimated 12,000 tons per day, enough to keep dozens of divisions fed with ammunition and gasoline as they crossed a continent that did not have patience for delays. The line's endurance came from design as much as will, a one-way loop that reduced friction at intersections, refueling points mapped in advance, and maintenance shops placed so that breakdowns became stops rather than endings. The convoy looked like sheer mass, but what held it together was choreography, 1,000 small rules that made the difference between a road and a supply chain. The Germans asked the obvious question with a sting in it, where were the horses, and the answer was written on every canvas-topped bed that rumbled past. The Wehrmacht had relied heavily on horses for logistics, a choice that demanded fodder, water, rest, and time, while on good days the Red Ball trucks ran around the clock, traded haystacks for fuel points, and replaced exhaustion with scheduled maintenance. Horses could forage but not keep pace with mechanized movement without breaking down, whereas the express's engines did not tire and could be rotated off the line for service without starving the front of movement. Hard-working teams required up to 12 pounds of grain daily and hours of human handling, all of it absorbed into the supply chain before a single shell reached a gun, while a truck ate gasoline and time in a way spreadsheets could predict and support. The contrast was cruel and simple. One system depended on muscle and fodder and the weather, the other on fuel, roads, and parts numbers that matched the crates in a depot. The Americans themselves never let anyone forget who kept that convoy moving. Most Red Ball units were black truck companies, a majority presence because roughly 73% of motor transport service truck companies in the European theater were African American. Contemporary figures would credit these drivers, often working with limited rest and under blackout conditions, with carrying more than 400,000 tons in the 82-day window and sustaining 28 divisions through the fall. Later summaries would echo the same figure, describing nearly 6,250-ton trucks driven largely by black soldiers who turned roads into lifelines despite the rain, the ruts, and the risk of attack. The convoy's discipline did not hide improvisation so much as hone it. When drivers did cut side roads or bypassed a regulating station, the MPs and traffic control posts existed to pull them back into the flow, because in supply even small disobediences could become large delays. The mechanics reading the traffic knew this was not magic, it was management, and management is how tonnage becomes distance. On maps, the routes drew great loops. Round trips of roughly 670 to 750 miles for the 3rd and 1st Armies at the Express's greatest reach, stretches long enough to make fatigue a logistics variable that had to be measured and tamed. The line ended officially on November 16, when Antwerp's port capacity and repaired rail lines could assume the load, but by then the lesson was already stamped into memory like a unit crest on steel. Supply that begins with trucks can hand off to ships, rail, and pipelines, and each handoff only works if the system behind the windshield is the same one behind the crane, the switch, and the pump. The Express's numbers would become a shorthand, the 5,958 vehicles, the daily 12,500 tons, the 412,000 plus total, but those numbers translated into days of attack sustained, into bridges fed with engineer timber, into armored thrusts that did not stall for lack of gasoline. The Germans watching from the ditch did not need to see the end of the road to understand what they were looking at, the road itself was the argument. They tried to imagine such a route in their own order of battle and reached the same barrier every time. Horses cannot be made to march in one-way circuits without rest and reprovisioning that cannibalize the very throughput an army needs to keep momentum. The Allied system could spool up truck companies, reassigning drivers, concentrating motor transport, and erecting a traffic police in khaki, to achieve in days what a horse-drawn echelon could not match in weeks. When they looked again at the American line, they saw more than engines, they saw a theater-wide decision to give logistics priority and to enforce that decision with signs, MPs, schedules, and the authority to stop everything else until the supply column had passed. This was what a mechanized army looked like from the side of the road, not just machines under load, but a bureaucracy turned into motion, a plan that had found its axle count. The trucks faded into the heat haze and the road returned to silence, but the thought did not. Battles are decided by bullets, yes, and by fuel, and by who can move them faster, farther, and more predictably, day after day after day. They captured more than one Jimmy by September, and with each one the pattern sharpened, the same levers, the same lubrication plates, the same manuals in the glove box that taught you to keep the truck alive before it needed saving. A Dodge WC 6x6 appeared among the trophies, different silhouette, different weight class, but its paperwork spoke the same language, with the same style of technical manuals and ordnance catalog codes that pointed mechanics to the right bins with the confidence of men who already knew what would be inside. What startled them was not that everything was identical, but that so much was intentionally harmonized, procedures, part numbering, supplier catalogs, and maintenance sequences, so a soldier could move from one vehicle to another and still be in the same conversation. In the CCKW family the logic was explicit and printed. The standard nomenclature list for the two 1/2-ton G508 trucks cross-referenced assemblies and made plain what could be swapped and what was superseded, so a depot could send the right crate without chasing lore. The same SNL entry spelled out that major units like the transfer case and transmission lined up with the amphibious Dukas versions, identical or near identical with minor differences, making rivers and roads part of the same supply story. A mechanic who knew the CCKW's banjo or split axles by sight could read the interchange chart and know at a glance whether the bearing or seal he held in his hand belonged on a DUKW or had been superseded by a later pattern that still fit. It was not magic, it was a paper promise kept in crates and stamped numbers that made the battlefield less dependent on memory and more dependent on reference. Even where trucks came from different makers, the ordnance system taught a common grammar, Group G catalogs that sorted vehicles by function and family, or D7/8/9 volumes that defined what you carried, what you could requisition, and what you would bolt back on when the old part failed. TM9801, the CCKW's operator and organizational maintenance book, did not exist in isolation, it lived alongside supply catalogs that the manual explicitly cited for stock numbers, tying the driver's daily checks to the depot's ledgers. The lubrication orders were to be carried with the truck at all times, standardized instructions reducing ambiguity until grease guns and intervals could almost run without argument. A depot sergeant could read the same codes a private saw on the page and feel certain that the requisition written beside a road in the rain would match the box arriving 2 days later. Tires told the story in rubber, across the two 1/2-ton class, the Studebaker US 6, kin to the CCKW in purpose if not lineage, rolled on 7.5020s like the Jimmy, a practical convergence that meant tire stacks at depots fed more than one badge on the grill. If a road column mixed Studebakers and GMCs, the tire piles still made sense, and every mile you could keep a pile coherent was a mile fewer spent sorting confusion in a downpour. The Dodge WC62/63 lived in a different weight class and wore 90016S, a reminder that complete cross-compatibility wasn't the rule, but even there, the broader standardization was visible in manuals, electrical equipment catalogs, and repair doctrine that made each family intelligible to anyone trained in the American way of maintenance. The point was not that everything fit everything, but that everything fit the system. Electrical gear followed this pattern of unity through diversity. Ordnance Technical Series covered supplier families like Delco-Remy for electricals and Carter or Zenith for carburation, so a mechanic could approach the charging system or a fuel fault with a book in hand that matched known components across multiple vehicle families. In practice, that meant bench procedures, test values, and exploded diagrams were recognizable even when castings, brackets, or engine bays differed, a single technical language mapping onto many dialects of hardware. When a unit rotated a man from a CCKW motor pool to a Dodge company, he didn't have to unlearn how the Army named parts or scheduled inspections, he brought his fluency with him. The manuals were less about one make and more about a way of working that let the Army scale expertise without hoarding experts. The Germans kept finding proof that the American trucks were designed to be read as much as they were designed to be driven. TM9801 linked operator checks to echelon maintenance, organizational tasks at the company, deeper work pushed up the chain, and even specified that the lubrication order itself be present with the vehicle, fusing doctrine to the dashboard. The same book pointed the soldier to the ORD-7 SNL G508 for the official list of tools and spares, making the supply catalog the authority rather than the memory of whoever happened to be on duty. When a part was superseded, the SNL tracked what replaced it and whether the new would fit the old, turning change into continuity rather than a dead truck waiting on the wrong crate. With each additional CCKW they studied, each with the same levers, the same stencils, the same grease points circled in red, the mechanics felt the pressure of inevitability that standardization exerts on time. A truck idling with a torn boot or a failing seal could be brought back with a swap, and the swap could be planned because the book told you what the part was called, what bin it lived in, and what hands needed to touch it. They followed a lubrication diagram that matched numbered points to intervals and materials, and when weather turned vicious the manual already had Arctic instructions that reduced winter to an engineering problem instead of a surprise. It was the same ethos they saw on the road in the Red Ball Express, discipline by design, throughput by rule, and in the motor pool it looked like parts that fit and procedures that worked even when the hour was late. The comparison with their own depots stung because it was not only about numbers, it was about coherence. The Wehrmacht's motor pool was a patchwork by necessity and policy, not only with German types but with large numbers of captured French and British vehicles pressed into service after 1940, adding dozens of makes and models to a fleet already short of spares and standard tools. Captured vehicles solve a shortage today while creating maintenance headaches tomorrow, each new badge demanding new parts, new diagrams, new tricks learned on the fly as the weather and the front changed. Even within German makes, performance could be excellent but commonality was not a governing priority across the entire fleet, so workshops and warehouses absorbed friction that manuals and catalogs would have bled away. By contrast, the Americans had made the paperwork itself into a weapon, SNLs that grouped families by G numbers, ORD 7/8/9 volumes that put allowances, lists, and diagrams in the same taxonomy, and TMs that told drivers and corporals exactly what to do, when, and with what in their hands. It scaled because the naming and numbering scaled, because parts requests didn't change shape when they crossed a state line, and because the institutional memory lived in the book as much as in the man. The Germans studied a CCKW and saw an engine and axles. By the fifth one they saw a library on wheels, cross-reference to depots and factories 2 oceans away. When a convoy's spare parts truck opened its tailgate, all that indexing, coding, and crossfit was waiting on shelves, the promise kept once more in steel, rubber, and paper. On a muddy afternoon they tried a practical test. A seized transfer case in one captured truck was matched to the catalog, and the notes made plain that the assembly mirrored the amphibious cousins unit down to the bolt pattern, allowing a correct swap sourced from a different supply stream that fed the DUKW companies. The labor wasn't small, but the certainty was precious, confidence that the part would fit, that the shafts would align, that the next inspection step would be the one the diagram promised. Afterward, the Feldwebel folded the SNL and tapped its cover, calling it the only kind of poetry a mechanic trusts, the kind that rhymes with the right crate arriving on time. The truck rumbled off the stands and back onto the road, and behind it trailed a thought the men would not shake for the rest of the war. It is one thing to build a good vehicle, it is another to build it into a system where every book and box knows its place. They waited by the roadside for fuel that did not come, gray wagons of air in the tank and orders that could not move on empty, the kind of halt that turns an army's intentions into a chalk mark on a map while engines cool and men count cigarettes. Across the hedgerows somewhere beyond their line of sight, American columns still moved, because their logistics did not depend on tomorrow's miracle but on a timetable of trucks, depots, and routes that kept gasoline and ammunition flowing despite distance and weather. The Germans had known shortages before, but in 1944 the shortages had been engineered against them, oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants hammered until production collapsed, the lifeblood of movement evaporating under the weight of a campaign aimed at fuel itself. In April their total POL output still measured in hundreds of thousands of tons, by June it had been slashed to a third, and by September a fraction of what it had been, a 95% reduction that trapped mechanized units in place as if the roads had turned to rope. A driver can coax a tired engine, no one can conjure gasoline from an empty can. The report they wrote on the captured CCKW grew from this silence, the kind that teaches a different lesson than noise, that perfection is a luxury and good enough multiplied is strategy, that a truck designed to be produced, maintained, and abused at scale will beat a truck designed to be admired in a shop and nursed in a field. They did not spare themselves in the conclusion, noting that while their 3-ton 4x2 lorries were efficient on roads and capable in careful hands, they suffered in mud and snow where the American 6x6 layout turned traction from a wish into a plan. The CCKW did not boast higher paper performance, it boasted consistency, range in the 300-mile bracket on a 40-gallon tank and a driveline that kept pulling when shoulders sloughed into slurry, a combination that let gasoline travel to guns rather than die in the ditch. The manual's voice, so plain it was almost invisible, reinforced the point: preventive checks, lubrication by interval, escalations to higher maintenance echelons when the task exceeded the tools, each step a guardrail keeping trucks from becoming statues. In a year when fuel itself was a weapon turned against them, the Germans now faced an enemy that had also weaponized maintenance. Numbers, once abstractions, became the sharpest edge of the knife. American truck production did not count merely by factory, it counted by class and theater, with total U.S. Army purchases reaching nearly 2.4 million trucks across weight categories between 1939 and 1945, a mountain of tires and steel that ended arguments on roads. Of those, about a third fell into the 2.5-ton class that the CCKW defined, the very size that balanced payload and mobility for continental supply, making the Deuce-and-a-Half less a nickname than a logistics doctrine. GMC's own output covered a staggering share of that class, more than 520,000 of the CCKW 352 and CCKW 353 proper by conservative tallies excluding amphibians, with many sources citing roughly 562,000 when counting across variants and close kin. When totals expanded to include the DUKW amphibian and the 6x4 CCW, the figure rose toward some 572,500 units wearing the GMC lineage, a quarter of all wartime U.S. truck production and the lion's share of the 2.5-ton 6x6 fleet. The Germans did not need a blackboard to see what that meant, they needed only to remember how long the American convoys took to pass when they listened from the hedges. Against that tied the Opel Blitz, a truck they respected because it had carried them so far for so long, could not answer in kind. Sources placed total Blitz production across the war anywhere from about 82,000 to 130,000, a range that encompassed model changes, factory disruptions, and variants, but whatever number one chose it remained a fraction of the American totals. Most of those Blitzes were 4x2 S-type trucks, excellent on roads and adequate on firm ground, with 4x4 A-type models too few to change the texture of a convoy when the fields turned to paste. Precision had not failed the Blitz, quantity had failed the army around it, and the failure was not solely in assembly but in fuel and repair. In the report's margins, a mechanic scribbled a line he would repeat years later in the quiet of peacetime workshops: a machine that is good enough in great numbers is a doctrine by itself. What made 1944 decisive was not only what the enemy built, but what the enemy destroyed, first the Luftwaffe's strength over France, then the German oil heart that fed trucks, tanks, and trainers. The oil campaign went from strategy to avalanche as months passed, with heavy bombers and fighter bombers reducing synthetic plants at Luna, Gelsenkirchen, Wesseling, and other nodes to intermittent outputs and long repair shutdowns. In July alone, raids produced standstills and 20% destruction in key installations, and by September the cascading effect reached frontline units stripped of fuel. Production figures told the same story without adjectives. Aviation gasoline from synthetic sources dropping from 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 in July and 5,000 in September, across the same arc in which motorized units began to fail not through combat alone but through emptiness. The enemy's oil plan combined air attacks with strategic choices that starved nitrogen production as well, pinching explosives, fertilizers, and synthetic rubber, the extended skeleton of war that keeps trucks rolling and guns fed. No defensive position, however well chosen, could repel that arithmetic. Meanwhile, the CCKW's design had made a pact with American production realities years earlier. It used commercial-derived components that factories could build by the hundreds of thousands, accepted standardized assemblies that depots could stock, and asked for maintenance that tired men could perform with a diagram and a box of tools. The manuals linked the cab to the catalog, so that when a unit hit a fault beyond a corporal's wrench, the escalation had a name and the replacement had a part number, not a rumor. The 6x6 layout added what the map required, mobility off-road when roads failed, so that gasoline need not stop at the edge of a field or the far side of a shell crater. A range of roughly 300 miles on a tank might not sound like conquest, but logistics counts in round trips and intervals, and what matters is how predictably those numbers repeat without surprises that consume days. If war is half movement, then this was a truck that turned movement into a habit. The German officer who signed the report did not flinch from the larger lesson. The American automotive system had been designed for mass production before the war and bent to military purpose without breaking itself, whereas German excellence in engineering had too often led with bespoke solutions that did not scale under bombing, rationing, and the steady drain of a long fight. The CCKW's advantage was not that it was better in an absolute sense, it was that it was reproducible and reparable in the real world of shortages and fatigue, a real world where fuel would be bombed and men would be asked to do too much in too little time. He added a final line about fate, that on days like this, with dry tanks and dark roads, their army's future could be measured in trucks built elsewhere, in numbers and manuals and fuel that moved like weather. The page ended with a signature, a date, and then the next task: get the captured truck running, save what could be saved, and wait for orders that would move only if gasoline returned. The CCKW idled in the yard like a reminder, a steady note under a chorus that was growing fainter, and the mechanics began to plan another day of keeping someone else's machine alive. Snow lay in the folds of the Ardennes like a held breath when the December guns opened and engines caught, and the German offensive rolled west on roads already brittle with cold and intent that ran faster than its fuel could follow. The plan's austerity showed itself in its wagers. Panzer and mechanized divisions were to seize what they could not bring, counting on captured Allied depots to refill tanks and jerrycans as columns punched toward the Meuse and, in fantasy, Antwerp beyond. At the outset the weather turned Confederate, grounding Allied aircraft and cloaking the roads long enough that the advance achieved surprise, but even on those first days the math of fuel stalked every map trace and timetable. Traffic control faltered in the forests, bottlenecks braided at choke points, and the very mass that made the attack look formidable jammed itself when fuel trucks couldn't thread the knots and dumps blown by retreating Americans left only blackened drums in the snow. There is a sound to a panzer battalion going quiet, a series of coughs, then stillness, and men who have trained to fight begin to count miles backwards toward a dump that no longer exists. In the background to that winter gamble ran a longer ruin. The Allied oil plan had already broken the back of German petroleum, oil, and lubricants production through a relentless air campaign that reduced output by over 90% between spring and early autumn 1944. The numbers were brutal and personal, because every ton not refined was a road not traveled, synthetic aviation gasoline falling from 175,000 tons in April to 5,000 in September, and mechanized units that once maneuvered now rationed idling because the next can might not arrive. That famine of fuel made the Ardennes offensive a paradox from its first order, an operation designed to capture fuel because it could not carry fuel, spending precious reserves to reach depots the enemy meant to destroy rather than surrender. When U.S. engineers and quartermasters fired stocks they couldn't haul, German tankers found the ash testimony of a supply chain that preferred denial to capture, and crews turned to siphons and prayer in equal measure. The gamble had always been time-boxed by fuel, and the box shrank with every day the weather lifted and Allied air returned to the roads with rockets and bombs. Alongside that main thrust skulked an operation whose nerve outran its resources, Otto Skorzeny's Panzerbrigade 150 in Operation Greif, English-speaking commandos in American uniforms using captured vehicles to misdirect, move signs, and seize bridges if fortune smiled. The plan called for scores of vehicles and near-native accents. What assembled was a ragtag crew that scrounged jeeps and trucks, disguised a few panzers, and sent several dozen men behind American lines to sow confusion out of proportion to their small number. They created panic enough that military police grilled drivers for passwords and redirected columns at pistol point, but they did not seize the Meuse crossings or change the arc by which fuel and time strangled the offensive. The ironies multiplied as German orders counseled using captured U.S. vehicles whenever possible to conserve fuel and blend in, a tacit admission that the enemy's logistics and machines had become the only reliable sources on that battlefield. When those machines could not be had, panic dressed up as ingenuity and then ran out of gas. By the end of December the winter sky cracked open and Allied aircraft came back to the roads, the dumps, and the bridges, and the bulge began to look less like a new front and more like a protrusion that would be cut away. German columns that had made quick gains began to slow as fuel ran thin and wrecks choked the same roads that had carried them forward, while at Bastogne and Saint-Vith the clock ran for the defenders and against any hope of a breakout to the Meuse. Allied fighters and fighter-bombers returned to their cruel arithmetic, shredding supply lines and strafing traffic until movement itself became hazardous for those who still had gasoline. Behind the American lines, traffic discipline congealed into regulation and the logistical machine flexed, with military police, movement control, and engineer units doing the invisible work of turning ice and ruts back into roads that could support counterattack. The specific face of this discipline was not drama but order, signs, corridors, convoys at set intervals, and a willingness to stop everything that wasn't supply until supply had the road. If the German plan dreamed of Antwerp, the Allied reality was already unloading there, because the port had been opened on November 28 after the Scheldt estuary was cleared, and the first convoy, Fort Cataraqui leading, made the river feel like a new artery coming online. That opening did more than shorten the Red Ball Express's lifeline. It rewrote Allied logistics from ad hoc long-haul trucking into a port railroad web stabilized by forward depots at Liège and Namur and a flow that no longer had to fight the entire breadth of France. The U.S. Transportation Corps and COMZ planners treated Antwerp as a node to be governed rather than a miracle, allocating rail corridors to Liège, Namur, Luxembourg, and highway routes that stitched Antwerp to Brussels and onward so port discharge could translate into forward tonnage without creating an unmanageable heap on the quays. Storage was tight and V-weapons would soon make the port a target, but the doctrine held, keep intake at a rate that matched outflow, pile it on the ground only when necessary, and push as much as possible into inland depots where roads and rails could redistribute risk. In that sense, the end of the Red Ball Express on November 16 was not an end but a graduation. Trucks still ran, but they ran inside a system that had gained a new port and repaired rails and pipelines to carry fuel in bulk. Winter's bite didn't relent, so engineers fought it the way armies must, with graders, corduroy, snow removal, and endless drainage to keep water from turning verges into traps that devoured wheels. Unit histories in the ETO read like road diaries, felling trees, laying timber, clearing rubble from Cherbourg to the Ardennes, and then doing it again after thaw and shelling undid yesterday's work, because mobility is not a condition but a practice renewed daily. In the Ardennes weeks, engineer battalions parked as much under the weather as under orders, turning mud to surface and ice to traction where possible, building the literal lanes of counterattack that would push the line back to where it had been. Where German motor columns tangled themselves on narrow, icy routes without fuel to recover lost time, American movement benefited from a bureaucracy that knew how to police traffic, ration roads, and rebuild them in the teeth of winter. The silent triumph was not a glamorous bridge, but 100 miles of drivable road on a day when the snow kept falling. When the bulge finally deflated in January, the accounting was stark. Tanks abandoned not for lack of courage but for lack of gasoline, an offensive planned around capturing fuel that found mostly flame and empty barrels, and an enemy whose supply system had matured into an interlocking net from Antwerp to the front. The same trucks that once thundered down Red Ball routes were now one instrument among many, their miles multiplied by rail wagons and pipelines and ports that cut the long haul into manageable stages. The German hope that weather and surprise could substitute for production and logistics died on roads where traffic jams and fuel famine erased the first week's gains. And beneath it all sat the lesson that had been murmuring since Normandy, that logistics is a discipline, not an improvisation, and that an army that treats it as such will still be moving when winter tries to stop everything. The mechanics who had learned to admire a captured GMC could see the same philosophy play out at theater scale: design for throughput, enforce the rules, and let the simple things, done everywhere, decide the fate of campaigns. The retreat toward the Rhine stripped war down to what still moved, and the captured mechanics learned that the GMC CCKWs kept answering the starter in weather and ruts that punished their remaining 4x2 lorries, not because the American trucks were elegant, but because they were built and maintained to tolerate abuse as a routine condition of life. The difference no longer felt like a theory about design cultures, it was a morning test with cold hands, where a 6x6 with a simple transfer case and leaf-sprung axles left a depot on time while a precise road truck waited on tools and space it could not always have. By late winter 1945, as American forces pressed through the Rhineland, the Germans' working vocabulary shifted from admiration to resignation. Reliability under neglect decided more days than peak performance under ideal care. Surrender turned the horizon from battle maps to fences, and the men saw what a fully motorized army looked like from inside its camps: rows of CCKWs staged for runs, line bays with tools laid out against a lubrication order, and a rhythm that made readiness sound like a verb. Processing moved by truck and rail in a system that treated movement as a solved problem rather than an improvisation, while motor pools ran on the same doctrine printed in technical manuals that had been tucked in glove boxes at the front. The very ordinariness of those vehicles around depots and camps, standard bed racks, predictable tire sizes, familiar levers, made clear that the truck was as much a piece of paperwork as it was a machine. Inside the wire, the work did not stop. Across the Allied world, German POWs were put to labor consistent with the Geneva Rules, and in the United States this meant everything from farms and factories to shop floors where skilled hands relieved shortages created by mobilization. At some camps detainees even repaired U.S. military vehicles in unit motor pools, turning captured mechanics into contributors to the very maintenance culture they had spent months decoding from manuals and metal. The arrangement was transactional and disciplined, pay entered into camp accounts, supervision strict, but the practical effect was unmistakable. Labor flowed where the war had made holes, including into bays where engines cooled under open hoods. There the Americans' philosophy unfolded with the calm of a checklist: fix small faults early at the organizational level, escalate what exceeded tools and time, and design the machine so assemblies could be swapped instead of nursed back from failure in place. The lubrication order was not a poster, it was a schedule that tied grease points to miles and days, the sort of small discipline that prevents big catastrophes and keeps a fleet available for the only metric that matters: movement. Manuals were written to be followed by tired men in bad light, and they pointed directly to supply catalogs so names and numbers in a requisition matched what a depot would load into a crate. For heavy work the doctrine was blunt: push deep repairs to better equipped echelons so units did not bleed readiness trying to do in a yard what a rebuild shop could do faster with the right fixtures and spares. Ordnance histories told the same story in broader strokes: procurement, distribution, and maintenance knit together so that replacement assemblies moved along planned routes and arrived where they could be installed without drama. In practice that meant an engine or transmission could be removed and a serviceable unit installed while the original went upstream for overhaul, turning a potential week of downtime into a day of bolts and adjustments. The Germans knew they had good machines, they also knew their motor pools lived with fragmentation, dozens of makes, captured types, and a patchwork of parts and procedures that wore out time, nerve, and notebooks. The Opel Blitz remained a respectable workhorse, but most wartime models were 4x2, and keeping so many different vehicles in service demanded a fluency that could not be standardized across a continent in retreat. What they envied in the American system was not a single component but the fact that everyone, from a driver to a depot clerk, spoke the same technical language printed in TMs and SNLs, working side by side with young American soldiers in motor pools. The POW mechanics absorbed the value of that language, that the name you gave a part decided how fast it arrived, and that a numbered diagram could be worth more than a drawer full of improvisations. They saw why field units prized assemblies that came out as clean packages and went back in with the same bolt pattern, because speed in maintenance is not haste but forethought translated into design. Even the small rituals, tagging cores, logging serials, returning empties, became obvious once the goal was clear: maximum availability tomorrow, not maximum elegance today. The lesson hardened into conviction as winter receded. A truck's greatness in war is measured by how easily it can be kept in service by ordinary hands, with ordinary tools, inside an extraordinary system that makes the right part appear on time. The CCKW's ubiquity made the point easy to see, because its strengths were not hidden: the 6x6 traction, the straightforward frame, the familiar controls, the manual that assumed fatigue and answered it with sequence. In the bays and yards where they worked off their capture, the Germans quietly admitted what the roads had already taught them: that the Americans had designed not only a truck, but an ecosystem in which any competent mechanic could make it live another day. The first months after capitulation felt like a long exhale over rubble, where roads were half memory and half gravel, and yet the same olive-drab silhouettes that had haunted them in retreat now appeared as instruments of reconstruction: GMC CCKW convoys hauling timber, pipes, and sacks of cement into cities whose maps had been redrawn by fire. The trucks did not come as conquerors anymore but as carriers, their standard cargo beds stacked with what bridges, schools, and depots needed, their familiar levers and stamped plates speaking the same language of procedure and uptime that had fed armies and now fed a recovery. For mechanics who had surrendered with grease still under their nails, the new work was both humbling and clarifying: fix the trucks that had beaten them and use those trucks to rebuild the towns that would hire them. They taught the young, boys who had learned war by sound alone, how to hold a wrench the American way, with a manual open to the right page and a parts number on the requisition that matched the crates in the yard. When the American trucks rolled through the gates at first light, the sense of inevitability returned, but now it wore a gentler face: availability as mercy, standardization as a form of hope. Then came the big check with a bigger idea behind it: the Marshall Plan, a program that moved beyond speeches to the practical work of purchasing and shipping what Europe needed: food, fuel, raw materials, machines, vehicles, and equipment, so the economies could stand, produce, and trade instead of only remembering how to mourn. By mid-1951, of roughly $13 billion in U.S. aid, about $3.4 billion bought raw and semi-manufactured inputs, $3. $2 billion kept kitchens and fields alive with food and feed, $1. $6 billion filled coal bunkers and tanks with fuel, and $1. $9 billion purchased machines, vehicles, and equipment, the steel and rubber and gears that would turn workshops back into factories. To the mechanics who now wore civilian caps, the detail mattered. Imports funded by the plan arrived as crates of engines and presses, stacks of tires, pallets of bearings and seals, things a hand could lift and a shop could install to make something new move under its own power. The German word for this was Wiederaufbau, but the practice of it looked like a motor pool scaled to a nation: checklists, procurement, delivery, and a schedule that redeemed days by turning them into output. The Marshall Plan taught them that logistics could also be a peacetime virtue, a way of respecting the future by making sure the right machine reached the right floor on the right morning. In Wolfsburg, a British major with a taste for order and opportunity walked through a battered plant and refused to let its story end in dismantling. Ivan Hurst saw a factory that could build transport for a starved economy and for an occupying army with too few vehicles of its own. On August 22, 1945, the British military government placed an order for 20,000 Type 1 saloons. 2 weeks later, another 20,000, converting the idea of demolition into a schedule of deliveries that would put people back to work and cars back on roads. Repairs began under British trusteeship, machines recovered from storage, roofs patched, supply lines for glass, batteries, and steel coaxed into flow, and the first civilian car left the line on December 27, 1945 like a proof of concept stamped in primer and hope. By 1948, with Heinrich Nordhoff at the helm and a workforce counted in thousands, the Wolfsburg plant had become a functioning car factory again, and in October 1949 the British returned trusteeship to German hands, leaving behind a culture of production that prized process as much as parts. Hurst's intervention taught a generation of German engineers and managers that it was possible to jumpstart precision with standardization and to let a simple, robust product carry an entire region's recovery on 4 modestly powered wheels. Southwest and Russelsheim, another thread of continuity reknit itself. Opel, long a GM company before the war, resumed car production under the shadow of ruined hulls, and in November 1948 General Motors formally reassumed management control as the plant stood itself upright again. Passenger car lines like the Olympia and Capitan were back in the catalog by late 1948, even as the ruins of the Brandenburg Truck Works told a harsher story about what could not be salvaged from the eastern horizon. The symbolism was not lost on the mechanics who had balanced both worlds, the Blitz that had carried them through war and the American trucks that now carried them out of it, because the name Opel still meant frames and rails and assembly lines that could be taught to speak a more global language of process and scale. When historians later traced the financial charts, they also traced a technical migration. GM's management resumes, the press dies strike again, and the product plan again bends toward high-volume models that marry German craftsmanship with American lessons in manufacturability. The lesson on the shop floor was simpler: line balancing, tack time, interchangeability, and maintenance as a planned activity, not a favor performed by wizards. Standards filled the air again, but now they came with committees and acronyms that promised something sturdier than improvisation. IN, born in 1917 and reasserted in a nation that needed to harmonize bolts, bearings, and blueprints across a rebuilding economy. Beyond Germany's borders, ISO was founded on February 23, 1947 to make international standards a peacetime engine of trade, so the threads of specification could cross languages and currencies without tangling. DIN joined ISO as a full member by 1951, and the handshake between Berlin and Geneva meant that a drawing from a shop in Cologne could be read in Coventry or Detroit without translation errors that wasted steel and days. What wartime had taught in the cruelest way, that too many different parts names and sizes slowed everything, became peacetime policy: normalize what you can, and your factories will run faster while your warehouses shrink. The men who once read U.S. technical manuals by lamplight now read DIN and ISO sheets at desks, nodding at the same quiet intelligence: common threads, common diameters, common formats to keep process smooth. Even the alliances put standardization at their core, because the next crisis would not forgive bespoke. NATO's STANAGs defined common procedures, calibers, markings, and logistics methods so one nation's stores could feed another's formations without a pause at the shelf. By the mid-1950s, the NATO codification system, built atop the U.S. Federal Catalog System, gave members a uniform method for item classification and identification, with STANAG 3150 and 3151 putting supply language on the same rails, part numbers first and misunderstandings last. The codification mindset, name it once, stock it once, make it visible across a continent, was wartime wisdom domesticated, and Germany learned to play this language as fluently as anyone in the alliance. Logistics had become a coalition art, and standardization the grammar that made that art travel from depot to depot without interruption. Engineers who once counted bolts on a single truck now counted how many armies could share a bolt. Meanwhile the old warhorse kept working. The CCKW, phased out in American units by the rising M35 in the 1950s, remained in U.S. service into the mid-1960s and in Allied service even longer, its plain virtues exactly what rural roads and hard jobs demanded. The trucks lived second and third lives in forestry, construction, and civil defense, wherever a simple 6x6 with a forgiving frame and a known parts catalog could outlast the terrain and the weather. To the Germans who had learned their craft maintaining captured jimmies, each siding was an echo: the square cab, the timber bed slats, the same transfer case that had taught them the order of levers on a night with no moon. The Blitz, revered and restored in museums and parades, now read as a monument to a different industrial philosophy: excellent engineering that could not be multiplied fast enough when the world insisted on millions rather than tens of thousands. It was not a criticism of the truck so much as an elegy for an era when perfection felt like enough. The factories learned to speak both truths at once: German precision and American scalability could live together on the same line, if the components were designed to be made and replaced with as little ceremony as possible, and if the supply chain kept faith with the drawings. Shop stewards and foremen posted the new standards where everyone could see them, counting bolts and minutes in the same ledger, and the men in blue coats discovered that consistency had a beauty of its own when the shift ended with targets met. The apprentices the POW mechanics had trained became masters in their own right, designing fixtures and writing procedures that left less to chance and more to scheduling, because that is what the next economy demanded. They made cars and trucks for a market that had learned to love reliability as much as finesse, and they shipped them to customers who expected a part ordered on Tuesday to fit on Thursday without fuss. When those cars crossed borders inside a NATO whose warehouses spoke STANAG, the circle closed. War's bitter lessons had been transmuted into peacetime competence. By the end of the 1950s the country ran on roads that no longer swallowed trucks as often, on shops that stocked bolts that matched drawings, and on factories that produced at volumes that would have seemed indecent in an earlier age of craft pride. The CCKW still appeared in the countryside like a veteran with an honest job, a municipal tanker here, a fire brigade ladder there, while the Beetle hummed in towns that now felt young again. Opel's lines moved with a confidence that came from both the memory of rubble and the discipline of reattached management, their cars and trucks proof that a company could be German in sensibility and American in scalability without tearing itself in two. What the mechanics had learned in the mud and the motor pools, write it down, number it, make it fit, make it last, had become the quiet catechism of a new industrial life. And when they wiped their hands at the end of a shift, they sometimes glanced at an old manual on a shelf and smiled at the thought that a simple truck had taught them how to rebuild a country. In a quiet hall where white light sits on paint and steel, two trucks rest side by side, the American GMC CCKW Deuce-and-a-Half and the German Opel Blitz, both restored to the sheen of remembrance and both telling a story that was never really about shine. The plaques are merciless in their simplicity, the sort that condense years into a few lines. CCKW, designed 1941, over 500,000 built across variants by 1945, the long wheelbase 353 the dominant silhouette on Europe's roads, Opel Blitz, 3-ton class, wartime production often cited around 100,000, mostly 4x2 S-type, an honest, capable truck that was outnumbered, not disgraced. Visitors lean to read the smaller text and find the same lesson in a different grammar. One truck engineered for scale and serviceability, the other for precision within limits that the war made harsher with every month. Between them there is no sneer, only an arithmetic of output, endurance, and the kind of maintenance that tired men can deliver after midnight with a manual open on the fender. The CCKW's caption does not boast, it counts. GMC's wartime 2.5-ton 6x6 production, CCKW 352 and 353 most of all, lands in the 500,000 range even when excluding amphibious Dukus, with high estimates cresting toward 562,000 when kin and variants are rolled into a single mountain of steel and rubber. The truck stayed on after victory, shouldering post-war work through Korea, then serving stateside and in Allied fleets until the mid-1960s, a long twilight that belonged to simple frames and forgiving drivetrains. The plaque makes a point without flourish, that the Jimmy was designed to be built and kept alive, not merely admired, and it could be taught quickly to drivers who had never been within 1,000 miles of a factory before the draft. A visitor who lingers sees tiny things in the drawings, transfer case positions, lubrication points, parts numbers, that anchor the larger story, a machine with a paper trail that matched the crates in depots 3 states away. The Blitz's plaque is equally plain and equally fair. It notes that Opel delivered tens of thousands of 3-ton trucks across the war, commonly summarized around 100,000 to 130,000 depending on counting frames, chassis, and late war disruptions, most of them 4x2 S-type vehicles that did steady work on roads but struggled when rain turned verges to paste. It nods at the rarer 4x4 all-rad models without pretending they changed the lived experience of a convoy bogged on a bad day. What the truck lacked in numbers it made up in dependability within its lane, a truth that a good museum honors by putting competence beside scale rather than below it. The bitterness belongs to history, not to the object. The Blitz carried a nation until the nation could no longer carry itself. A docent gestures from one grill to the other and says what the men in the field learned the hard way, that in modern war, the decisive trait is not the single vehicle's greatness but the system's ability to produce, supply, and repair that vehicle faster than the campaign can wear it down. The CCKW's numbers make that system visible, production at Pontiac and St. Louis, standardized assemblies that also fit the DUKW, and manuals that spoke the same language to drivers, corporals, and depot clerks. The Opel's story makes the limits visible, strong performance on roads, constrained volumes, and a fleet that could not be made uniform across a continent being bombed out of its own factories. The contrast hurts because both trucks are good, only one lives inside a supply ecosystem ruthless about sameness. On a small stand a sign mentions the Red Ball Express, and the CCKW's shadow lengthens with the memory of convoys that moved 12,000 plus tons a day for roughly 3 months in 1944, a one-way loop enforced by MPs and route discipline that turned trucks into arteries of a continent-sized body. That sign is less about romance than about governance, signal, regulate, schedule, and the miles will come, because engines don't tire and the levers only move in the right order. If a visitor asks why the Express ended in November, the answer points to Antwerp's opening and rail lines reborn, a logistics machine that grew a new node and didn't need to redline its trucks across all of France anymore. The truck is an instrument, the symphony is the system that knows which instruments to use and when to set them down. A second small sign bridges war to peace, explaining how post-war Europe turned defeat and rubble into factories and roads, and how standardization moved from survival tactic to economic policy. DIN reasserted itself at home, ISO took shape in 1947, and Germany joined a wider discipline where a bolt's thread and a bearing's tolerance are shared promises rather than local dialects. Visitors are surprised to find NATO in the story, until the sign spells out that an alliance lives or dies on whether one nation's part fits another's need, which is why STANAGs and the NATO codification system lift the paperwork to the same plane as the parts. The moral is not obscure, logistics wins wars and then builds prosperity if it is allowed to keep speaking in clear, common numbers. Back at the trucks, the captions carry their final quiet verdicts. The CCKW's entry ends with a line about replacement by the M35 and about long afterlives in Allied service, civil defense, forestry, and construction, wherever a plain 6x6 and a known parts list can still beat weather and time. The Blitz's entry ends with a photograph from a parade in a post-war town, a beautiful artifact now, a bearer of memory rather than loads, its sheet metal reflecting a sky that once held the noise that ended its world. On the wall between them hangs a sentence that could have been written by any mechanic who survived that era: perfection matters, but in sustained conflict and recovery, standardization and quantity are the grammar in which success must be written. No one argues with the wall. The docent, who has walked this room 1,000 times, adds a coda that starts with a badge, not a truck: Volkswagen's restart under British stewardship, Ivan Hurst's decision to make a factory useful rather than dismantled, proof that the most American of wartime lessons, designed for manufacture, could be learned and put to German use without surrendering precision. Opel's return to GM control in 1948 and the resumption of high-volume models tell a parallel tale, scale grafted back onto craft, the assembly line as a discipline rather than a sacrilege. In that blend lives the post-war German miracle, drawing tolerances that respect the shop floor and writing procedures that respect the calendar. The museum leaves visitors with the feeling that a truck can be both object and teacher, and that the best museums are schools where steel does the lecturing. Before leaving, people turn once more to the CCKW's hood seam and the Blitz's front fender and see that the lesson is not nostalgia, but an ethic: make it simple to build, simple to service, and simple to replace when hours matter more than elegance. NATO's warehouses, ISO's rulebooks, DIN's tables, those are artifacts, too, even if they live on paper and servers, each a descendant of the conviction that clarity saves lives and makes wealth. And as the doors close and footsteps fade, the trucks keep telling their story without sound, one an emblem of quantity made coherent, the other of quality caught in a storm of shortages, both necessary to remember if the next generation is to repair more than it destroys. In the end, nothing about the verdict is cruel, it is precise, like a torque value whispered across years to a hand that still knows what tight enough feels like. The CCKW and the Blitz share the room as equals in honor, but history makes them unequal in force, and museums exist because truth, to be humane, must also be exact.